In the annals of naval warfare, some victories defy all logic. They are not won by superior tonnage, overwhelming firepower, or advanced technology. Sometimes, they are won by sheer, unadulterated audacity, a gamble made in the dark by men who have nothing left to lose. In the early hours of December 26, 1943, in the frigid, pitch-black waters of the Bismarck Sea, such a moment unfolded. On one side, the Yamagumo, a towering, 2,000-ton Japanese Shiratsuyu-class destroyer, a masterpiece of Imperial Japanese naval engineering, armed with 5 5-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and depth charges. A wolf of the sea, designed to hunt and kill. On the other side, PT-59, a 78-foot-long American patrol torpedo boat, made of plywood and mahogany, weighing just 56 tons. Its crew of 13 were dwarfed by their opponent, their vessel scarcely more than a splinter against the steel behemoth. The mission was simple, suicidal. Intercepted Japanese destroyer-led convoy reinforcing their garrisons in New Guinea. For the men of PT-59, it was to be another harassing attack in a long, grueling campaign of guerrilla warfare at sea. They would fire their torpedoes, fill the night with machine gun fire, and vanish into the darkness. But on this night, the script was torn apart. A single, perfectly placed torpedo would strike the Yamagumo, and in a cataclysm of fire and twisted metal, the mighty destroyer would begin its death plunge. This is the improbable, unforgettable story of when David not only faced Goliath, but sent him to the bottom, a tale of wood versus steel, where courage and a bit of luck changed the course of a night battle. To understand the sheer improbability of this encounter, we must first set the stage of the broader war in the Southwest Pacific in late 1943. The strategic initiative had shifted decisively to the Allies. Following the grueling victories at Guadalcanal and in the Papuan campaign, General Douglas MacArthur was driving his relentless island-hopping advance along the northern coast of New Guinea. The Japanese, desperately trying to shore up their crumbling defensive perimeter, relied on the Tokyo Express, fast naval convoys, often running under cover of darkness, to funnel troops, supplies, and equipment to their isolated garrisons. The key Allied tool to interdict this vital sea lane was not the battleship or the cruiser, but the humble, fragile PT boat, operating from hidden, primitive forward bases like Dregger Harbor and Conacopa. These mosquito boats of motor torpedo boat squadrons, like Ron 7 and Ron 9, waged a relentless, nocturnal war. The protagonist of our story, PT-59, was commanded by a 27-year-old lieutenant from New Jersey, John H. Jack Gibson. Gibson was a seasoned PT skipper, having survived months of punishing operations in the slot-off Guadalcanal. His boat, one of the ubiquitous 80-foot Elko boats, was a study in contrasts. She was fast, capable of over 40 knots with her 3 thunderous Packard V12 engines, but she was also breathtakingly vulnerable. Her hull was made of double-planked mahogany over plywood frames, offering no protection against anything heavier than a rifle bullet. Her armament was potent but short-ranged. 4 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes, a 20mm Oerlikon cannon amidships, and several 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Her crew were a mix of young Americans, radiomen, torpedomen, gunner's mates, and quartermasters, each a specialist in keeping the temperamental craft running and fighting. They lived in a world of constant damp, engine fumes, and the ever-present anxiety of a sudden encounter with a Japanese warship that could vaporize them with a single salvo. On the other side was the Yamagumo. Commissioned in 1937, she was a veteran of multiple battles, including the Java Sea and the Solomon Islands campaigns. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander Masayuki Arita, she was a true warship, 350 feet long, displacing 2,070 tons at full load. Her main battery could throw a 50-pound high-explosive shell over 10 miles. She carried 9 24-inch long lance torpedoes, the most feared naval weapon in the Pacific, and depth charges for hunting submarines. Her crew numbered over 200 seasoned Imperial Japanese Navy sailors. On the night of December 25, 1943, the Yamagumo was leading a small convoy, including a troopship and a smaller auxiliary, on a high-speed run from Rabaul to reinforce Japanese positions at Seo on the New Guinea coast. It was a routine mission for her, one of many dangerous runs down the slot of the Bismarck Sea. For Commander Arita and his crew, the primary threats were Allied aircraft by day and perhaps submarines. The PT boats were a nuisance, like gnats, irritating, but not considered a mortal threat to a modern destroyer. That underestimation would prove fatal. The night of December 25, 1943, was typical for the region. Overcast, with a low ceiling of clouds blotting out the moon and stars. A light rain fell intermittently, and a moderate swell rolled across the Bismarck Sea, making for a wet, uncomfortable ride on the small PT boats. At their forward base, intelligence had come in from coast watchers and aerial reconnaissance. A Japanese convoy was expected to transit the Vitez Strait that night. Lieutenant Gibson, along with two other PT boats, PT-60, commanded by Lieutenant J.G. William Bud Leibner, and PT-61, commanded by Ensign Robert Bobby Atkinson, received orders to form a division and intercept. The mission profile was standard: locate the enemy, make a high-speed run to firing position, launch torpedoes from 1,000 to 2,000 yards, then turn away and use smoke and speed to escape the inevitable counter-barrage. By 2,300 hours, the three PT boats had cleared their base and were cruising in a loose V formation, their engines throttled back to a quiet murmur to reduce their telltale wake and engine noise. The darkness was absolute, a tangible blanket that pressed in on the men. On the bridge of PT-59, Gibson and his executive officer, Ensign Paul Red Ryland, strained their eyes, scanning the inky horizon with binoculars. The only sounds were the rush of water against the wooden hull, the steady rumble of the idling engines, and the constant, eerie whine of the wind in the radio antennas. Every man was at his station, nerves taut. Below deck, the torpedoman, like Seaman First Class Frank Skip O'Hara, made final checks on the Mark 8s, ensuring the firing pins were set, the depth mechanisms calibrated. In the gun tubs, the crews huddled under tarps, trying to stay dry, their fingers resting near the cold metal of their weapons. The first indication of contact came not from sight, but from sound. At approximately 0030 hours on the 26th, the radioman on PT-59, Seaman Second Class Tommy Walsh, picked up a faint, distorted chatter on the Japanese naval frequency. It was direction finder intelligence, vague but promising. Gibson signaled the other boats with a brief, shaded blinker light. Eyes sharp. Possible contact bearing north-northwest. The trio changed course, their engines still quiet. The tension aboard all three boats was a living thing. Men whispered prayers, checked their life jackets, and made sure their knives were loose in their sheaths. They knew the drill. They had done this before, but each time was a fresh roll of the dice with death. Then, at 0115 hours, a lookout on PT-60 gave a hushed, urgent call. Smoke! Bearing 030. All binoculars swung to the bearing. At first, there was nothing but darkness. Then a faint, darker smudge against the slightly less dark sky. The silhouette of a ship. Then another, and another. It was the convoy. Gibson, using his seasoned judgment, estimated the formation. One large destroyer in the lead, a smaller destroyer or large escort trailing, and at least two larger, slower merchantmen or troopships in the center. Yamaguma was in the van, a black shark cutting through the swells. The PT boats were down moon from the convoy, a slight tactical advantage. Gibson made a quick calculation. The standard attack called for a coordinated, simultaneous torpedo launch from multiple angles to bracket the target. He signaled PT-60 and PT-61 to split, with PT-60 taking the port flank and PT-61 the starboard, while he, in PT-59, would make a direct frontal approach, drawing the enemy's attention and fire. It was a bold, aggressive plan, the other skippers acknowledged. By 0125 hours, the attack commenced. Gibson gave the order. All ahead flank, standby torpedoes. The three Packard engines on PT-59 roared to life with a deafening, visceral bellow, a sound that could be heard for miles. The boat leaped forward, its bow rising as it planed across the water, throwing a massive, phosphorescent wake that glowed eerily in the darkness. Instantly, the Japanese lookout spotted them. A signal lamp flashed from the bridge of the Yamagumo, a challenge in Morse code. There was no answer. Instead, the 20mm gunner on PT-59, Seaman George Gunner Kelly, opened up, stitching a line of red tracers toward the destroyer's bridge. It was a futile gesture at that range, but its purpose was psychological: to distract, to confuse. The Yamagumo reacted with the terrifying efficiency of a veteran warship. Her 5-inch gun swiveled, searching for the source of the tracers. Seconds later, the night was torn apart by the blinding flash and thunderous crump of her main battery firing. The first salvo was short, the shells throwing up towering geysers of white water 100 yards off PT-59's starboard bow. The concussion slammed into the wooden boat, shaking it to its keel. "They've got our range," Ryland yelled over the din. Gibson, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, jinked the boat hard to port. Then starboard, executing a desperate, zigzagging evasion. The Japanese gunners corrected. The second salvo was closer, the shockwave peppering the PT boat's deck with hot shrapnel and seawater. A piece of shell fragment tore through the canvas bridge screen and embedded itself in the chart table next to Gibson. He didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on the looming silhouette of the Yamagumo, now growing larger by the second. The range was closing rapidly. 3,000 yards. 2,500 yards. The other PT boats, PT-60 and PT-61, were now also in the fray, their own machine guns sparking, drawing secondary fire from the convoy's escorts. The night became a chaotic tableau of streaking tracers, muzzle flashes, and the deafening, overlapping booms of naval artillery. On PT-59, the torpedo officer, Chief Torpedoman's mate Henry Hank Doyle, was crouched by his tubes, waiting for the command. The boat was shuddering under near misses. A near miss from a 5-inch shell off the port quarter sent a column of water crashing over the deck, drenching everyone and shorting out one of the 50 cal mounts. Gibson knew he had one shot. The textbook firing solution was gone, lost in the violent maneuvering. It would be a snapshot, an instinctive act. At 2,000 yards, dangerously close, he screamed, "Fire 1. Fire 2. Doyle yanked the levers. With a hiss of compressed air and a splash, 2 Mark 8 torpedoes dropped into the water, their propellers biting, steering toward the target at 46 knots. "Hard to starboard. All guns, give 'em everything," Gibson ordered, spinning the wheel violently. PT-59 heeled over in a tight, skidding turn, its guns blazing in a final, defiant outburst to cover their retreat. As they turned away, every man on board held his breath, counting the seconds. A torpedo run at that range would take about 90 seconds. They were the longest seconds of their lives. The immediate aftermath of the torpedo launch was a maelstrom of noise and light. PT-59, now presenting its narrower stern to the Yamagumo, was racing away at full speed, a desperate attempt to open the range. But the Japanese destroyer, having weathered the initial machine gun fire, was now fully focused on this impertinent insect. Her searchlights snapped on 2 brilliant, blinding shafts of light that swept across the churning water before locking onto the fleeing PT boat. Instantly, PT-59 was illuminated in a harsh, white glare, every detail exposed. She was a perfect, slow-moving target in the lights. "Kill those lights! For God's sake, kill the lights!" Gibson shouted. The 20mm and the remaining 50 cals swung around, firing upward at the blinding orbs. Tracers arsed toward the Yamagumo's bridge, sparking off her metal superstructure. But the lights held. What happened next was a minute of pure, unadulterated terror for the crew of PT-59. With the PT boat perfectly lit, the Yamagumo's secondary armament, her 25mm anti-aircraft guns, joined the fray. These rapid-fire cannons, designed to shred aircraft, now turned on the wooden boat. A hailstorm of explosive shells, each round a fist-sized burst of shrapnel, began to walk across the water toward them. The sound was a continuous, ripping BRRRRRT mixed with the higher-pitched crack of the 5-inch guns still firing for range. The first 25mm rounds found their mark. They stitched a line across the aft deck of PT-59. The portside 50 caliber gun mount was hit directly. The gunner, Seaman Jimmy Watts, was thrown backward, killed instantly. His assistant, bleeding from multiple fragment wounds, crawled away from the shattered weapon. Rounds punched through the thin wooden hull amidships, exploding inside the crew compartment. Splinters, as lethal as bullets, scythed through the air. The radio shack was destroyed in a flash of sparks and flame, killing radioman Tommy Walsh. The acrid stench of cordite, burning wood, and blood filled the air. On the bridge, Gibson and Ryland were pinned down by the onslaught. Shrapnel whizzed past their heads. The windscreen was shredded. Gibson, feeling a searing pain in his left arm, looked down to see his sleeve torn and blood soaking through. Ryland had a deep gash across his forehead, blood streaming into his eyes. The boat itself was dying. One of the Packard engines took a direct hit and seized with a horrible metallic shriek, billowing black smoke. The steering began to feel sluggish. The rudder had likely been damaged. PT-59 was slowing, turning into a sitting duck. "We're losing her, Jack," Ryland yelled, wiping blood from his eyes. Gibson knew it was true. The gamble had failed. The torpedoes had either missed or run deep. They had drawn the dragon's breath, and now they would be consumed by it. The Yamagumo, confident of her kill, began to turn slightly, perhaps to bring her full broadside to bear or to finish the job with her machine guns at point-blank range. For the men of PT-59, this was the end. There was no escape. The other PT boats were engaged with the escorts and could not help. They were alone, crippled, and illuminated in the killing light. Despair, cold and final, gripped every surviving heart. This was the crisis point, the moment the daring attack had turned into a catastrophic, fatal failure. But beneath the waves, unseen and unheard in the chaos, a different drama was unfolding. The two Mark 8 torpedoes from PT-59 were running true. One, set at a shallower depth, had been spotted by a sharp-eyed Japanese lookout on the Yamagumo's starboard wing. The alarm was raised. Torpedo, starboard side. Commander Arita ordered an emergency turn to comb the tracks, to present the ship's narrow bow or stern to the incoming weapon. The great destroyer began to swing. It was a standard, textbook evasion, and it worked for the first torpedo, which passed harmlessly ahead of the ship. But the violent turn presented the Yamagumo's full, long port side to the second torpedo, which, running perhaps a foot deeper, had gone unnoticed. It was a fatal alignment. At exactly 0134 hours, the second Mark 8 torpedo struck the Yamagumo just aft of her forward smokestack, on the port side, near the number 2 boiler room. The impact was not a muffled thud, but a colossal volcanic explosion that split the night. A towering pillar of white water, mixed with flame, smoke, and debris, erupted alongside the destroyer, climbing higher than her mast. The sound reached PT-59 a second later, a deep, booming whump that was felt in the chest, momentarily drowning out the gunfire. The Yamagumo's lights flickered and died as her electrical systems failed. The searchlights blinding PT-59 went dark, plunging the PT boat back into merciful shadow. For a second, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the hiss of escaping steam from the mortally wounded destroyer. The crisis had pivoted with seismic suddenness. The Hunter was now the mortally wounded. On PT-59, the shock was instantaneous. The Japanese gunfire ceased abruptly as the crews on the Yamagumo's weapons were thrown from their stations or scrambled to deal with the catastrophic damage. Gibson, his mind racing, instantly seized the opportunity. All ahead on 2 engines. Port engine, give me everything it's got. Move, now. The 2 remaining Packards roared, and the battered PT boat, trailing smoke and leaking fuel, began to limp away from the dying destroyer, seeking the cover of darkness. The immediate threat was gone, but the night's work was far from over. The Yamagumo was hurt, but she was still afloat, and her escorts were now fully alerted and enraged. The battle had entered a new, even more dangerous phase: the kill. The torpedo hit had crippled the Yamagumo, but it had not immediately sunk her. Japanese damage control parties, drilled to a fine edge, rushed into the inferno. The explosion had torn a massive hole in her port side, flooding the forward boiler room and severing steam lines. The great ship began to list to port, gradually at first, then more noticeably as thousands of tons of seawater rushed in. Her speed bled away. She was dead in the water, a wallowing, burning giant. The convoy's other escort, a smaller Momi-class destroyer, the Yamakaze, broke off its engagement with PT-60 and PT-61 and raced to the side of her stricken leader, circling like a protective hound, her guns searching the darkness for the elusive PT boats. Aboard PT-59, the situation was dire but now charged with a desperate hope. They had drawn blood. The impossible had happened, but they were in no shape to press the attack. One engine was dead, steering was compromised, and they had multiple casualties needing urgent attention. Gibson, his own wound hastily bandaged, assessed his boat. They had one torpedo left in their starboard tube. The other boats, PT-60 and PT-61, were still in the fight, but they too had taken minor damage and were low on torpedoes. The decision was agonizing. The prudent, survivable choice was to disengage, to take their wounded and their battered boat and retreat into the night, leaving the crippled destroyer to its fate. It was what the Japanese would expect. It was what the manual suggested. But Gibson saw a different reality. The Yamagumo was vulnerable, a titan brought to its knees. If she could be saved by her consort, towed to a friendly port, she would be repaired to fight another day. The entire point of their sacrificial, guerrilla war was to bleed the Japanese Navy, to sink ships. This was a chance to claim one of the biggest kills ever by a PT boat, a fleet destroyer. He grabbed the voice tube to the radio, forgetting it was destroyed. He then signaled with a handheld blinker light, a risky but necessary communication to the other boats. AM damaged. Yamagumo dead, eye in water. Will attack with last torpedo. Cover AMI. It was not an order to the other skippers. It was a statement of intent. He was going in. The turning point was this decision: to turn a damaged, fleeing boat back toward the enemy, to risk the few lives he had left for a chance to finish the job. On PT-60 and PT-61, Leibner and Atkinson understood instantly. They acknowledged with brief flashes. Their role would be to harass and distract the Yamakaze, to draw her fire away from PT-59's final, desperate run. It was a supremely dangerous tactic. The Yamakaze was fully alert, her radar and lookout scanning aggressively. As PT-59, trailing a slick of fuel and moving at a painful 15 knots on two engines, began a wide, limping turn to circle back toward the burning destroyer. The Yamakaze spotted her. Guns flashed. Shells began to fall around PT-59 again, but now with less accuracy. The smaller destroyer was herself maneuvering violently to avoid the harassing attacks from PT-60 and PT-61, which were darting in and out of the shadows, firing their machine guns and launching their own last torpedoes at long range. For 10 agonizing minutes, PT-59 crawled through the darkness, a wounded animal stalking a wounded giant. The crew performed miracles. The chief engineer, machinist mate Joe Grease, Santarelli, somehow coaxed a few more RPMs out of the straining port engine. The surviving gun crews, though reduced in number, kept up sporadic fire, more for morale than effect. Gibson, with Ryland acting as his eyes, navigated not by chart, but by the towering pillar of black smoke and the occasional flare of internal explosions from the Yamagumo. The destroyer's list was now pronounced, perhaps 15 degrees to port. They could see frantic activity on her decks, the tiny figures of sailors trying to fight the fires, and the eerie sight of lifeboats being swung out. Gibson's plan was simple and brutal. He would approach from the Yamagumo's starboard side, the high side of her list, where her main battery, now canted at a useless angle, could not depress enough to hit him. He would close to point-blank range, inside 500 yards, and fire his last torpedo into the area of the initial hit, hoping to breach additional bulkheads and guarantee her destruction. It was a knife-fight tactic, one that left no room for error. As they closed the distance, the heat from the Yamagumo's fires was palpable, washing over the PT boat. The sounds of screaming metal, explosions, and shouted orders in Japanese carried across the water. The smell was a complex, nauseating 1009 of burned oil, cordite, and seared flesh. At 500 yards, Gibson gave the order, "Stand by final torpedo." Doyle, "Make it count." The torpedoman, his face blackened with soot and sweat, nodded grimly. The boat was shuddering, its hull groaning from previous damage. The Yamakaze, having driven off PT-60 and PT-61 for a moment, was now turning her attention back, realizing the intent of the lone, limping PT boat. Her guns began to find the range again. Shell splashes walked closer. "Steady, steady," Gibson murmured, holding the course, ignoring the incoming fire. At 350 yards, an absurdly close range for a torpedo attack, he yelled, "Fire." The last Mark 8 leapt from its tube. It hit the water, ran for a mere 4 seconds, and struck the Yamagumo almost directly amidships, just below the bridge on the starboard side. The secondary explosion was apocalyptic. The torpedo detonated in or near a forward magazine or fuel bunker. A fireball, orange and white, rolled upward, engulfing the forward superstructure. A series of sympathetic detonations followed, ammunition, torpedoes in their tubes, depth charges on the racks. The Yamagumo's back broke. Her hull, already fatally weakened, jackknifed in the middle. The bow and stern sections rose into the air as the center collapsed into the sea. The sounds were horrific. The shriek of tearing steel, the thunder of explosions, and the screams of men trapped within. In less than 2 minutes, by 0155 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer Yamagumo slipped beneath the black waves of the Bismarck Sea, taking Captain Arita and the majority of her crew of over 200 men with her. The victory was absolute. Wood had conquered steel. In the stunned silence that followed the destroyer's sinking, broken only by the crackle of spreading fuel fires on the water and the distant, fading gunfire from the fleeing Yamakaze and the remaining convoy, the men of PT-59 could only stare. There was no cheering, no triumphant shouts. There was only a profound, weary numbness, a disbelief mingled with the immediate, pressing needs of survival. Their boat was sinking. The single, surviving Japanese escort, after rescuing a handful of survivors from the water, chose discretion and fled north with the remaining troopship, unwilling to linger near the scene of such a shocking ambush. PT-60 and PT-61 closed in on PT-59. The sight was grim. PT-59 was low in the water, her decks a shambles of splintered wood, tangled metal and blood. Wounded men groaned in the scuppers. The smell of gasoline was overpowering. A single spark would doom them all. What followed was a 3-hour ordeal of damage control and triage under the threat of dawn and possible Japanese air patrols. The crews of the 3 boats worked as one. The most critically wounded from PT-59, including Gibson and Ryland, were transferred to the less damaged PT-61. The dead were laid respectfully on the deck, covered with tarps. Machinist Mate Santorelli and a team from PT-60 performed emergency repairs on PT-59's hull, using blankets, mattresses, and wooden plugs to slow the inflow of water. One of PT-59's engines was declared a total loss, but the other 2, miraculously, were kept running. By 0500 hours, as a gray, rainy dawn began to break over the Bismarck Sea, the 3 battered PT boats, with PT-59 limping along between her 2 consorts like a wounded comrade, began the slow, anxious journey back to their base. They were low on fuel, crammed with extra men, and utterly exhausted. But they were alive, and they had accomplished the impossible. The aftermath of the action was a mix of official recognition and the quiet, personal cost of war. Lieutenant John H. Gibson was awarded the Navy Cross for his extraordinary heroism, daring tactical skill, and unwavering devotion to duty. Several members of his crew, including the deceased, received Silver Stars and Purple Hearts. The sinking of the Yamagumo was confirmed by Allied intelligence through intercepted Japanese communications and later through aerial reconnaissance. It was a significant tactical victory. The loss of a modern destroyer and its seasoned crew was a sharp blow to Japanese capabilities in the region, further constricting their already tenuous supply lines to New Guinea. More importantly, it was a monumental psychological victory for the PT boat forces. It proved, beyond any doubt, that these small, wooden boats were not just nuisances, but legitimate ship killers capable of taking on the best the Imperial Japanese Navy could send against them. The myth of the PT boat as a mere mosquito was shattered that night. In its place was born a legend of daring that would inspire crews for the rest of the war. The legacy of PT-59 and the sinking of the Yamagumo extends beyond a single battle report. It became a textbook case in asymmetric naval warfare, studied for its lessons in night fighting, small unit audacity, and the effective use of torpedoes by fast attack craft. It underscored the critical importance of the PT boat campaign in the Southwest Pacific, a campaign that strangled Japanese logistics and contributed directly to MacArthur's successful advance. For the men who were there, it was the defining moment of their war. Some, like Gibson, would go on to command PT squadrons. Others would carry the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, bound together by the shared memory of that terrifying, triumphant night. But perhaps the most profound significance lies in the sheer narrative power of the event. In an age of steel dreadnoughts and aircraft carriers, this was a throwback to an older, more visceral form of combat, a close-quarters duel decided by nerve and a single well-aimed shot. It is a story that resonates because it is a classic underdog tale, a validation of courage and skill over sheer mass and power. The Yamagumo was a symbol of Imperial Japanese naval might, a product of a massive industrial war machine. PT-59 was a wooden boat built in a New Jersey yard, manned by a handful of young Americans from every corner of the country. On December 26, 1943, in the dark of night, the latter proved that will and opportunity could defeat even the most formidable opponent. It was a victory not of machinery, but of men. The 16 crewmen of PT-59 who sailed out that night, and the 13 who returned, wrote a small, brilliant, and bloody chapter in the vast history of the Pacific War, a chapter that forever answered the question of what happens when wood decides to take on steel. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII-Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.